As many of you know,
Can I use this?
we're
Almost
being
forgot.
recorded. Yeah, we are being recorded, so I hope everyone's okay with that. As many of you guys know, there's a lot of well-founded concern right now about this country's ability to have a free, fair, and safe election in November that results in a peaceful transition to power. There's been a lot of press on this topic, mostly at the federal level, focused on whether there's going to be a rerun of January 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol. A fear of it's being fueled by office holders and candidates today who are continuing to spread disinformation, continuing to challenge the legitimacy of the 2020 election,
Oh,
and most amazingly are refusing to disavow violence in the event of an election result that they don't like, which is sort of hard to believe that this is even happening. And it seems like more and more politicians each day are coming out and refusing to take a principled stance on that, which blows my mind. Just this week, there's also been a lot of press happening on personal threats that we're seeing with office holders at the state, federal, and even local level. This past week, there was a big article in the New York Times, an investigative report called "We'll See You at Your House: How Fear and Menace Are Transforming Politics." I recommend that to those who haven't read it, but it's disturbing, and Derek can talk a little bit about that and other areas. But what tonight's focus is going to be is really on an equally important and troubling threat to the security of our elections, which are threats to the election processes themselves and the safety of election officials that are widespread at both the state and the local level. So this is getting less press, but it is very disturbing. These people at the state and local levels are the ones who are administering our elections. And the threats are real, and they've increased even over the last year and certainly over the last 4 years. So tonight we're going to start with Derek. Maybe give us a little take on the Brennan Center conducted the survey that just concluded at the beginning of the month, focused on this issue, and then led to a report on its findings. We're going to run through the summary of the highlights, the key takeaways from that this evening. Derek, maybe you could start by just giving us a little bit more background on the survey itself, the kind of methodology you used, how broad was it, and what was it specifically focused on versus these other types of areas that I know Brennan Center is also involved with.
Yeah, that sounds good. So first, let me just say, really excited to be here with you all, talking about this very important topic. It's funny that Pat mentioned at the top that this group mainly focuses on climate and democracy, because I work in the democracy space and my wife actually works in climate, and we have this recurring joke that we're real fun at parties when we're just raising alarm all the time. But anyway, I'm happy to be here talking about this important topic. So as you mentioned, the Brennan Center has been conducting an annual survey of local election officials since 2022. And we reach an audience of nearly 1,000 election officials. There are somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 election officials across the country who operate either at the county level or in some states at the municipal level, and they do the actual work of running elections. So we're able to reach a very large slice of this community. And then, of course, we do demographic weighting on our end to make sure that we are talking to a representative sample of this community. And the idea to do this survey came out of a report that we did after the 2020 election, and that report was called Election Officials Under Attack. We were deeply concerned during the 2020 election and the immediate aftermath as lies about the election began to fuel attacks on the people who run elections. And those attacks ranged from, false allegations that these individuals were carrying out fraud, to meddling in the election process, and then to harassment and violent threats. And in the process of developing that report, we spoke to dozens of election officials across the country, and they shared harrowing stories about the threats and harassment and intimidation they had received by members of the public who, again, had been fueled by lies. Their voicemails and emails were filled with outrage that often featured racial slurs, threats of sexual violence, and death threats. They were approached by members of their community or by people with guns. Some of the officials' children and families had been referenced in the threats or even contacted directly. And all of it was underpinned by suggestions that these officials had stolen the election, that they had rigged processes. And importantly, all of the officials we spoke to said they had never seen anything like this before 2020. Some of these individuals had been running elections for a decade, 2 decades, even more. They had never seen anything like that. And so after hearing these anecdotes, we really began to wonder just how widespread the issue was. And since we were only able to talk to, you know, a dozen or so officials, we fielded a survey in 2022. We have since followed up that survey in 2023 and 2024. And really, we continue to find that those experiences of the individuals we talked to directly were frighteningly common, were widespread, and it painted a much clearer picture of the new challenges that election officials are facing. Oh, Mark, you're on mute.
Sorry. Let's turn to the survey findings themselves, and maybe you could start with the good news. I think you know there has been these threats have been around for at least the last 4 years, and there's been some progress made. So I think we can start there, and then if you could run through the sort of the key findings with respect to threats that remain. After that, we'll turn to what we can all do to help with these threats. But let's run through that now. And Derek will take us through his presentation on that for the next 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, that sounds great. So first of all, just confirming that you can see the slides up.
Yeah.
Great. So as I said, the most recent iteration of this survey, we just released a couple weeks ago. This covered a period from February to March of 2024. We talked to around 1,000 election officials this year. Again, we did various weighting methodology to make sure that it was really a representative sample. One little quirk of election administration is that because Michigan and Wisconsin do things at the municipal level instead of the county level, about 1/3 of all election officials are either in Michigan or Wisconsin. So if we don't have this good team of social scientists that we have working at the Brennan Center, we end up talking to only 2 states. So we made sure we really have a representative sample here. And as you mentioned, this year we did something different, which was to ask not just about the challenges that election officials were facing, but what sort of improvements were they making to combat some of the challenges. So starting with that, we found that the vast majority of local election officials report that their offices have taken steps to increase election security since 2020. 92% of officials that we talked to had taken at least one of these steps that are listed here on this slide. So a lot of it was very much boosting the cybersecurity of their technology. 56% said they improved cybersecurity protections for election technology, taking some of those most recommended best practices, implementing multi-factor authentication, using unique user logins, putting in place endpoint encryption, some of those types of things. And then we see some of the other most common things, updating polling place contingency plans. This covered a wide variety of things, but essentially all election officials have a plan for if something goes wrong, here is what we're going to do. Because election officials are always planning for something to go wrong. It's impossible not for something to go wrong because the logistic undertaking is so massive when you are planning across, you know, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds of polling locations. You're working with temporary staff. One election official in one of the largest jurisdictions compared it to me like you're trying to plan 100 different weddings at the same time, right? Something is going to go wrong. They plan for that and they recover from it. Contacting law enforcement to share information or create emergency response plans. Again, very much in conversation with these rising threats, rising risks of intimidation. And then there are a few other examples here on this slide as well. So we know that election officials are taking action. They see that there are things happening. They see that there are challenges. They want to make sure they are prepared to run a safe and secure election to the extent possible. Going into the main findings from both this survey and the 2 previous ones that we've done, is we continue to find widespread experiences with with threats, harassment, and abuse, with more than 1 in 3 local election officials saying that they have experienced one of these. This slide actually has some definitions for harassment, abuse, and threats. And an interesting thing that we found is there was actually a slight uptick this year in the number of election officials reporting that they have experienced one of these. I believe it went from 31% last year to 38%. And this is the first year that we provided these definitions to our respondents. And what that suggests is that there was some underreporting going on in the past. That a common thing is that election officials, the behavior that they experience, they may justify as this is political speech, it's part of the job. And putting these definitions in front of them may have helped others realize that no, this is actually conduct that crosses the line. Even if it does not meet a legal standard for a threat, this is still inappropriate conduct and speech to direct at a public official. Another finding that we had is that the most common ways that those who reported threats experienced those threats were over the phone and in person. And this in-person finding in particular, I think has gone undercovered to the extent that there are discussions about it. And that's because whether it's groups like us, like the Brennan Center studying this issue, whether it's media, when there's an email, when there's a voicemail, when there's a social media post, you can show those things. You could replicate them. You can put out a report that shows examples of this. You can't do the same thing with these in-person interactions. And so I think it's kind of painted a picture that most of this is happening, on Twitter, on Facebook, on things like that. And that's not true. It's people being approached by members of their community. And being, again, this is specifically with threats. Not even the harassment and abuse that's reported. So that's something that we're really trying to get across as well, is this is an in-person risk, and obviously something that feels a lot scarier to election workers when that threat is directly in front of you. Another finding that we continue to see is that the safety concerns are driving some election officials to leave their jobs altogether. And it's not just because of these safety concerns. They're simultaneously reporting, frustration with the lies about their work. They're also just kind of reporting exhaustion after 2020. 2020 was such a massive undertaking with the pandemic. And because of all the attacks that have taken place since then, there are a lot of election officials who just feel like they've never gotten a break. They're constantly under attack. They're being harassed, and they decided enough is enough. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about local election officials is these are low-paid government employees. They may be part-time employees in some cases, and in most cases, elections is only one component of their responsibilities, in addition to maybe it's record keeping, maybe it's licensing, maybe it's, doing other things that a clerk would do for a county or a municipality. And so when you consider that and you consider everything they've had to deal with in the past 4 years, it's not surprising that some are saying enough is enough. This job's not worth it anymore. And so what we found is about a third of election officials saying that I know at least one election official who has left their position due at least in part to safety concerns. And this was a bit of an uptick from previous surveys. And the result of that is that nearly 1 in 4 local election officials will be serving in their first presidential election in 2024. This is really significant. Running elections is something that you only learn by doing it. You only get, maybe 1 shot at it a year, maybe 2 shots at it a year, depending on how many elections you're administering. And with all the number of things that can go wrong, the amount of planning that goes into it, you learn through doing. And we found that 1 in 4 local election officials have never done this before. Maybe they've done a primary election, maybe an off-year election. It's not the same as a presidential election when you're going to see way higher turnout, you're going to see much higher tension, and a much bigger spotlight on everything that you do. One of the other challenges that we looked at is not just, threats and harassment, but also the threat of political interference. This is something that a lot of election officials faced in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election, with the most famous example being, former President Trump asking Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia to find 11,000 votes. But there were other campaigns taken to pressure election officials to abuse their power in favor of a particular candidate, or to use their platforms to cast doubt on the accuracy of elections. This is something that is continuing to happen. It's not necessarily don't certify this election, but maybe it's change your procedures accordingly, or change the technology that you're using because we don't trust it, or again, maybe just trying to get election officials to come out and say, oh, there was widespread fraud or something else, another false allegation. So what we've found in our survey is that more than 3 in 5 local election officials are very or somewhat worried about political interference. 31% that they said that they are very worried about political interference. And specifically, the question was, how worried are you about political leaders engaging in efforts to interfere with how you or your fellow election officials around the country do their jobs? This is a pretty shocking total. Election officials, whether they are affiliated with a party or not, elected or not, they carry out their duties in a nonpartisan manner. They are deeply afraid of facing pressure to break that commitment to voters. And then going back to the certification process, the process of actually saying this is the person who won the election, who received the most votes, nearly 1 in 7 are concerned specifically about interference in that process. This doesn't seem like that big of a number, but it's shocking. The certification process is something that nobody had ever even really heard of before 2020, because it was just a run-of-the-mill administrative procedure. Candidate A has more votes than candidate B, and so I sign it and say that they're the winner. It wasn't until 2020 that people began to argue that this could be something else, that people could just say, we had concerns about the process and therefore we're not going to certify the election. So all that considered, 1 in 7 is a shockingly high number that we're seeing. And then finally, one of the things that we've really found over and over, both in our survey and from talking to election officials across the country, is a consistent expression that they need more resources. Elections have gone underfunded for a long time, but the job of running elections keeps getting more and more complicated as more technology gets involved in the process, as voting options expand, and then as they are being asked to wear so many other hats, right? It's not just running elections, it's being a cybersecurity expert, and it's being a physical security expert, and it's being a communications expert. And in 2020, it was being a public health expert. We keep asking more and more out of our election officials, and resources have not kept up. And we found that more than 4 in 5 local election officials said that their budgets need to grow to keep up with their administration and security needs, with 31% saying they need to grow significantly over the next 5 years. And alongside that, in terms of resources and capacity, more than 6 in 10 are concerned about retaining or recruiting enough election workers, and more than 4 in 10 are concerned about obtaining enough poll workers. And so we kind of asked about 2 different categories here: election workers being the more full-time staff who do the year-round aspect of planning, running elections, and then poll workers being the temporary staff that are needed in polling places to support the actual voting process. And so there are a number of officials who are concerned that they're either not going to have the resources they need to hire the people they need, or they're not going to have enough interest in these jobs necessarily. And one thing that I want to leave in terms of the finding is really, going back to the threats on election officials and the impact that's having, is just why we're so concerned about this. It's obviously horrifying, the idea that any public official would have to endure this type of behavior, but there is a broader impact on all of us as voters and on our democracy more generally, which is As we've seen, as increased threats and violence happen, election officials are choosing to leave this profession. In many cases, very experienced election officials are leaving. They're taking their knowledge with them. And anytime you lose experience in a profession, you're more likely to have mistakes, errors. These may be very small things. They may be things that were planned for and corrected immediately, and that would have no impact on anybody's ability to cast their ballot or have an accurate vote count. But with the spotlight on elections, any error is going to be blown out of proportion, and it's going to be used to spread disinformation and discredit the entire election process. And it's going to lead to decreased confidence in the process, which can in turn lead to the increased chance of threats and violence. And this is our concern with this issue, that we are stuck in this doom loop right now, that if we don't address this challenge, we're going to see more and more of that going forward. And so I'll stop sharing my slides there. But those are really the key findings in this year's survey.
Super helpful, Derek. Thank you. Addressing these challenges is the next question I'd like to turn to. I'd like to we can approach the issue at a number of levels. There's sort of long-term things that need to be done. And there's also the next 6 months. We're all, leading up to the election, what can be done. So I think covering both of those bases. Also giving us a sense of what work is going on out there. And it is encouraging to see that some progress has been made since 2020. But what work by organizations like Brennan and other organizations and at the state and local level is happening, or maybe even at the federal level is happening. And then I want to really turn to what this audience can do. Third Act is a group that's folks 60 and over. We're, I think, 70,000 strong now. The question is, we want to act. We're third actors. We don't want to just be aware and then go to Starbucks. We want to help. So maybe closing out too before we get to the Q&A from the audience on some thoughts on how what roles folks can play. And we have folks who are in states where like Oregon, where I am, where we have voting by mail. I volunteer to be a poll worker, but there aren't really polls. It's all happening by mail. What folks in states like California and Oregon can do to help, and then what folks in other states where maybe volunteering is a key piece of the equation. But after talking about all these threats, getting people to go volunteer is a challenge in and of itself. So lots to cover there, but I really want to turn the discussion to addressing the challenges and get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right that, groups like us, a lot of other stakeholders in the election space at this point are thinking of this on two tracks, right? Longer term, there are reforms that we are pushing, but near term, we have an election to run. And in many cases, especially when you're talking about changing laws, even getting more funding for elections, it's too late in the game to be changing things. There's a certain point at which election officials say we got to play the cards that we've been dealt, and so that's really where all of our attention is going. Is how do we take what we have? How do we make the process as smooth, as safe, as secure as possible? And what that looks like, for an organization like the Brennan Center is. Number one, obviously we're doing a lot of education, presentations like this, putting out reports, making sure people are aware of the issues that election officials are facing. And then two, we are talking directly with election officials. We're trying to get a better understanding of their challenges. We're trying to identify best practices. The thing about American elections is we have this extraordinary decentralization, right? Every state has different laws, different ways of running elections, and in some cases, even from county to county, they do things differently. But that doesn't mean you have nothing to learn from your neighbor, right? But because things are so decentralized, because election officials are overworked, there's often not necessarily this national sharing of best practices happening. And so there are groups like us that are trying to make that happen, trying to say, we know you're struggling with this challenge. But guess what? So is Nevada, so is Wisconsin, so is whatever state it may be. And here's how they do things. Here's how they've made it better. And so that's a lot of what we are doing right now in this space is just sharing practices, sharing support. In some cases, there are, organizations that have been set up in the past 4 years to provide more direct support to election officials. That has been made more complicated in some states because there are a lot of states that have tried to target the practice of private funding into elections of the type that we saw in 2020 when Mark Zuckerberg made these very large donations to a nonprofit who then helped fund various pandemic preparation materials for election offices. But in the process of banning these private funds, have passed laws that sweep pretty broadly, that have made it more difficult for outside groups to offer services to election officials, whether that is tech support, communication support, whatever it may be. So there's a little bit of a barrier to doing some of those things. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who want to help. And I think that is, as much as we talk about the threats to democracy that have been happening since 2020, there has been this counterbalancing surge of support, I would say, of people wanting to galvanize the process, wanting to support the election administration process, lift up the work that election officials do. And so there are, tech companies who are offering services for free. There are people, trying to boost the messages of election officials as trusted messengers. Doing whatever else they can to make their job easier, to support them. And even if it's as seemingly small as saying, look, we have your back, and the things that people are saying about the work that you do is wrong. That makes all the difference in the world to somebody who is struggling day after day. So that's kind of a broad level view of what groups like us are doing. I put up a slide about some of the individual actions that our election officials have been taking. Before we got to 2024, there has been some legislative movement in this space as well. There were a dozen or so states who have passed laws that have in various ways increased protections for election officials that target intimidating election workers or interfering in the election process, whether through criminal or civil penalties. So that's an area where we've seen movement. We've seen a half dozen or so states who have increased protections for the personal information of election officials. So saying that maybe it's that you can make a request to state agencies to say, I want my personal information kept confidential. And that stops, information from being posted publicly, but it also stops these sort of private companies that scrape government websites constantly and put up the information of election officials, right? And that's typically how people who are carrying out threats tend to find that personal information. They just kind of Google the election official's name, home address, and you'd be surprised if you all did that yourselves, how much information is actually out there about you, right? So there are protections that can be put in place to make it more difficult for people to find, a home address, a personal cell phone, maybe the school that their kids go to, whatever it may be, this types of information that is then used to facilitate threats and harassment. We've also seen a handful of states, passing more funding for physical security protections or increasing training available for how election officials can take steps to protect themselves online. We've seen increased de-escalation training happening for poll workers, and we've seen greater coordination between law enforcement. Not saying we want a cruiser in front of every polling place, because that's not something that election officials want. They recognize how that can be intimidating for their voters, but saying, here is what we want you to understand about the election process. And if we need a response, here is how we want you to do it in a way that respects the rights of voters and minimizes disruptions to the election process. So there's a lot of activity happening in this space. Getting to, what you wanted to close on in terms of, people who may be on this call, lawyers, non-lawyers who are interested in helping. As I said, the most immediate need is we got an election to run this year. right? I put up that slide earlier that a lot of election officials are concerned that they're not going to have enough poll workers. If you want to support the ability to run a safe and secure election, that's the #1 thing that you can do to help. Volunteer. Well, not volunteer, you do get paid for this work. But serve in your polling place on election day, during early voting periods, whatever it may be. There's a real need for it in a lot of jurisdictions everywhere across the country. It's a great way to, be directly there, carrying out the work, serving voters, making sure that that work is done with integrity. For others looking to support the election process, protect voting rights, safeguard against intimidation, who don't necessarily want to be a poll worker, there's a couple other main organizations I would recommend looking out for volunteer opportunities. So one is the Election Protection Coalition that runs the 866 Our Vote hotline. I'm going to try to drop a link in the chat right now. But this is really the main election protection coalition. They are looking for volunteers to both, monitor election day polling places, report any problems that they see to the hotline. They're also looking for people to do intake on the hotline, take calls, categorize them, make sure they're directed to the right people. And then they are also looking for, lawyers, other legal professionals in particular, to help address some of these issues. Again, there's around 10,000 election jurisdictions across the country. They need people everywhere in every state. And even if you think, my state is a solid blue state, a solid red state, there are no real stakes here. As I was saying before, any mistake anywhere can be blown out of proportion and be used to cast doubt on the entire process. We are trying to defend everywhere on the map this year. It's incredibly important. A second organization I would recommend this is a much newer one. It was stood up in the 2020 election, or after the 2020 election, specifically in response to the attacks that we've been seeing against election officials. It's called the Election Official Legal Defense Network. And this was founded by Democratic election lawyer Bob Bauer and Republican election lawyer Ben Ginsberg. And they are specifically looking for lawyers to do pro bono work for election officials who are facing harassment, facing intimidation, and they need some help. A lot of times they do not have an attorney on their own staff. They rely on their county attorney, who may or may not have time for them, or just may not have the expertise needed necessarily, right? Or in other cases, there are election officials who feel like they need their own lawyer, because maybe they're facing, harassing conduct from some of their own elected officials in their counties. So this organization is really set up to match volunteer lawyers to election officials in need. It's a great organization, so that's another one that I would recommend, again, specifically for lawyers who may be on this call who are looking to help out. So those are the two main things that I would recommend in the near term. Longer term, again, we are pushing for policy reforms to better support election workers, to keep good people in the election space, to make it easier to serve voters and to run secure elections. And in this advocacy, the decentralization of election administration presents significant hurdles. It's difficult to advocate changes in every state, let alone the thousands of local governments that have primary responsibility for funding and supporting election administration. And it's equally difficult to get people to pay attention to these problems in each of these jurisdictions and to tell the stories that may be happening outside of the handful of states that are in the political spotlight. We've seen this over and over, actually, where there may be somebody who raises the need for more funding, for legal protections for election workers, whatever it may be, and legislators at the state level, at the county level, saying like, okay, I know this is a problem in Arizona. This isn't happening here. I haven't seen this happen in my state. It is happening in their state. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in red jurisdictions. It's happening in blue jurisdictions, rural, urban, whatever it may be. We are seeing these same sort of issues. And so we need more people to raise the salience of these issues in county offices and town halls and state legislatures, whatever it may be, to sort of, build support and say, this is a problem that's happening. And here are some protections that can help. And the Brennan Center has, a lot of resources on that for those who may be interested in learning more about various policies that we're pushing.
Excellent. Thank you, Derek. Let's turn to the audience QA. We've got about 20 minutes left. Brian, maybe you could start bringing up some questions that have been raised in the chat. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Derek. Let me pull up. We'll start with a question from John Kidd from Bainbridge, Washington. And John asked, this problem, referring to the threats and harassments to workers, it reminds him of the work of Wilhelm Reich in the mass psychology of fascism and about the myriad powers of propaganda. This leads to a bunker mentality in the threatened and a reluctance to serve. Are there any communities that are doing a good job in using these threats to build community and push back? And a more specific legal question, can we use torts, tort of nuisance, et cetera, to go after selective threateners?
That's a great question. I will address the second one first, which is I haven't looked into that necessarily. There have been certainly an increase in, I don't know about an increase, but a handful of examples of defamation lawsuits being successful in these instances. The most famous example being the poll workers in Georgia that Rudy Giuliani spread lies about. But there's, an ongoing issue in Maricopa County, Arizona, with the recorder there who is suing Carrie Lake for defamation. There have been a handful of other examples of this as well. And so we're kind of seeing in real time whether this is an effective tool to help push back. But in terms of other remedies available in torts, it's not something that I've studied close enough. In terms of the other question, whether there are examples of, in the face of these threats, building stronger community. I think this is really happening in the election official community, actually. I think there are, at the same time as I say there are many people leaving this profession, there are others who have really become emboldened. And again, inspired by the outpouring of support from people who value our democracy and maybe ignored the work that election officials did before and how much work goes into actually pulling off an election, and are now sort of recognizing that. And there are people who are really inspired by that and are taking up that mantle. The other thing is, if there are 1 in 4 election officials who are doing their first presidential election this year, we kind of have this whole new class of election officials who their only experience of election administration is what happened after 2020. And these individuals are passionate. They often bring sort of different expertise and experiences to it. And they're excited about this work. They're excited to serve their community and serve voters. And so we're sort of seeing a really ambitious group of individuals filling these positions in many cases, which is exciting. The last thing I'll note is there is just more of a community among election officials, whereas they used to really be operating within their own jurisdiction. Maybe they had a state association that they were very involved in. Because the challenges have become more nationalized, there is more national communication happening. There are more people joining, for example, Election Center, which is the National Association of Election Officials. Their membership is way up since 2020. There are people who want to go, want to train, want to share best practices, want to do the best job they possibly can in this role because they know how much people are counting on them. The Election Center just updated their standards of conduct for election officials, which is something they first put out more than 20 years ago. They have this new document that they released earlier this year. And it is all about really building professional identity in election administration, and it's something that has been absent before. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in this space for sure.
Thank you. The next question comes from John Hands out of Richmond, Virginia, and trying to go a little deeper on some of the statistics. And his question is whether there are any statistics for actual physical attacks on election officials or their families. I expect some people trying to claim this is all a false flag lie would try to excuse at least some of the threats by saying that people should be able to blow off steam. Is any of the harassment coming from or enhanced by election monitors, people who are allowed to stand there and watch me identify myself and vote?
Yeah, so I think there were a few different questions there. So one is whether there are statistics on, actual violent conduct. This is not something we asked about in our survey, and I'm not aware of any comprehensive statistics on it. There are certainly examples of it. I mean, the most extreme example that we have seen was an individual in New Mexico who was upset about an election result and carried out a series of shootings on various elected officials' homes. There was a state legislator as well as an election official who was targeted in those shootings. This is the most extreme example of a violent attack that we've seen so far in this space. But most of the conduct that we have seen, thankfully, has not gone past threatening communications. Another thing is we've seen an uptick in instances of swatting, which is, for those who are unfamiliar, essentially calling law enforcement and saying that there is an emergency situation happening at somebody's home, somebody's office, and a situation that would involve a SWAT team, essentially. We saw a handful of instances of this, particularly for secretaries of state who are involved in disputes on whether to keep Trump on the ballot. So we saw this in Maine and Colorado. So there's another example where, that it's not necessarily violent conduct, but the person making those calls is doing so with the idea that at the very least, this will be incredibly scary for the person who is on the receiving end of these swatting incidents. And on the worst end would be a disproportionate response from law enforcement that actually leads to violence. So those were a couple examples on that point. And I believe one of your other questions was whether any of this intimidating conduct is coming from, election observers who may be in polling places, whether they are nonpartisan individuals or individuals associated with political campaigns. This is definitely something that we saw in 2020 of people in their eyes doing their job of watching elections, but doing so in a pretty aggressive manner. Kind of flouting the rules that are in place that keep people away from ballots, away from voters, away from voting technology, using aggressive language, throwing out accusations, that sort of thing. That's certainly something that we've seen since 2020.
A follow-up question on the monitoring. One of the observers asked whether jurisdictions allow poll watchers or monitors from outside their borders. Can a lawyer in DC provide assistance in one of the states in the region?
So I'll answer this in two different ways. So one is if you're asking specifically about Election Protection Coalition, 866-R-VOTE, if you are in the polling place, they are looking for people who are in that jurisdiction, right? But you can serve, again, as a hotline operator doing intake, and you can do that from anywhere in the country. So there are certainly opportunities to volunteer with that effort, regardless of where you are. In terms of more broadly, whether states allow election observers from outside of their jurisdiction, it varies quite a bit from state to state. Most often, you need to be from the county that the polling place is in, but this is not true everywhere. There are also some states, so Michigan is an example, where they have election observers and they have election challengers. Election challengers are people who are appointed by a political party or a qualifying nonprofit to be an observer, and they have the ability to challenge voters' eligibility. They also have something called Election Observer, which is just a general policy that our elections are open to the public and anyone from the public can come into a polling place. And as long as you're not disruptive, you can observe the process. And that could be someone from anywhere. They actually have no restrictions at all on whether you need to be an eligible voter in the state or from that jurisdiction or whatever it may be. So that's sort of my question in terms of my practical advice for helping out, and then also just what the legal background is on this issue.
And by the way, the election protection hotline, I don't think you have to be a lawyer to participate in that. I
Yes.
did it years ago, and it was a phenomenal experience. I'm planning to do it again, and I hope others can do that. But there were people on who had participated, help with intake, help with fielding registration related questions, things like that. You don't have to be a lawyer to do that.
That's a great point. Most of the volunteers are not lawyers, and they need plenty of people from all backgrounds.
It's
I
very
believe
rewarding.
if you follow that link that I shared, I think there's actually like 2 separate buttons for like, are you a legal professional? Are you not a legal professional? And that way they'll route you to wherever the biggest need is based on your expertise.
I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Does that sound good, Mark and Derek? Okay. I'm going to circle back to a question that came a little bit earlier in your presentation, and it was with respect to the those that were surveyed. Tim Rimple was curious if you had, Derek, if you had a sense of what percentage of the survey population could potentially be MAGA supporters, and if so, how that fraction of respondents would respond differently. He was getting at if the respondents that are not in that segment, that it would change the percentage with respect to the concern over, I guess, intimidation, harassment, and the numbers would actually be worse.
Yeah. Okay. I get what you're trying to say. We don't really have any insights into that aspect of our survey collection. We collect some demographic data about the election officials, gender, race, income, how long you've been serving, size of your jurisdiction, a few other things. But in terms of some of these ideological factors, we don't account for it in our survey. You know, we have seen some very high profile examples of election officials who themselves have bought into these conspiracies about the election. The clerk in Mesa County, Colorado, was one of the biggest examples of this, where she sort of worked with a outside group to allow access to their voting systems to do their own analysis and claim that validated their concerns about voter fraud. We saw a handful of other examples in Georgia and Michigan, a few other states. So we know that there are some election officials out there who are really sympathetic to these groups. We think it's a very small number overall. And so we don't expect it would be something that would substantially change our survey findings.
Okay, so I think the last question is one you spoke to, but I'm going to put it out there one more time to see if you have final thoughts. And there's a slight nuance to the question with respect to what we all can do in this upcoming election. And you had noted that folks can become poll workers. That would be the #1 thing to do to help support the process and safeguard against intimidation. You identified a couple different entities out there that we will provide to everyone post this call, and you identified longer term potential opportunities for policy reforms. A couple of folks had a specific question focusing on, I assume it's communications with the elected officials. What can we ask our elected officials to do about safeguarding the process? And so if you have any final parting thoughts about ways in which we may be able to engage and communicate with those that are, elected officials or running processes, and other ways in which those on the call can try to ask questions of their local entities.
That's a great question. So number one, the thing that I tell everyone that we need to be pushing for is money. It's a very simple thing, but the fact is, to address any challenge in election administration, you need more resources, you need more funding. Whether it is, these sort of safety concerns, right? If you want to purchase more, a better security system for your election office, if you want to purchase surveillance cameras, if you want to purchase better lighting for your parking lot so that people feel safer coming to work, if you want to purchase maybe key card access systems to make sure only people who are allowed to be in certain spaces are able to get into those spaces. There are all these things and they all cost money. And this is true across, cybersecurity challenges. It's also just true across voter access, right? We have seen a huge movement of states offering mail voting, early voting, all these things that are incredible for voters, that make voting more accessible, more convenient, and it all costs money to staff it, to get the technology you need for smooth processes, to acquire the physical space to count ballots, to buy ballots themselves. Paper is getting more expensive, right? All of this, we need better resources and election administration, and we just continue to fall short of what is needed. So that's the number one thing that I would encourage everybody to advocate for, to their federal representatives, their state representatives, their local representatives. All three levels of government have a responsibility for funding elections. The second thing is some of these legal protections for election workers that I was alluding to earlier. And we've really found a lot of election officials value these types of things that help keep their personal information private. That is, the officials we've spoke to in states that have set up these programs have just been really thankful for it. And I've sort of noticed a difference in the volume of communications that they may be receiving from harassing individuals at their, personal address or on their personal phone number. Obviously, all of their public, their office, their public number, those are all available to the public as always. These are public officials. Of course, people can reach out to them, but they want to keep their personal lives separate from that. And so I think that's one of the biggest policy reforms that we've been pushing and that we have found really makes a difference here.
Thank you very, very much, Derek. This has been excellent, and I hope folks have gotten a lot out of it. And we did record this, so we will be sharing the recording. And really, if you have questions, contacting me, Pat, Brian, and about what we can do as a group to follow up on how we might want to organize some activities within Third Act to support the work that Derek's been working on. Let's have those discussions. I'm certainly open to, and I know Brian and Pat are as well. So thank you all for taking time out this Tuesday on this important topic, and have a great evening. And thanks so much, Derek. Really appreciate it.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for letting me join.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Brian. Save the chat, everybody. We will send it around as well, but you might want to save it now. Okay. Have a good evening, all.
Okay.